Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at the abdominal viscera and peritoneum section of the course pack. This resource is brought to you by the Scrubs team, which is the student collaborative resources for understanding and Brody success. My name is Bryce Pugh and I'm in the class of 2027. We'll start with the Scrubs mission statement. Scrubs is a student-driven initiative that aims to develop supplemental resources for current and future cohorts that will pass through Brody. Members of Scrubs participate in a variety of subcommittees working to create resources for students by students. These resources aim to offer unique perspective from students that have walked in the same shoes, developing resources that we wish we had been exposed to during our time in the course. The hope is that this organization will become a staple of the Brody student body, exemplifying the unique collaborative community that Brody offers. If this is a mission that aligns with your goals and you have the desire to help those that will come behind you, as well as a goal to leave your mark on Brody as a whole, we invite you to join the team. And a quick disclaimer, the resources that are included in this document are made by students, not the faculty. As such, there's a possibility for error in our development, although this is mitigated via a team approach to development with multiple stages of vetting. If there's a contradiction within the coursework presented within your course, please go by the course documents. Additionally, Scrubs aims to supply supplemental resources. However, these are in no way a replacement to the instruction of the Brody faculty. Use these resources as a supplement, not as your primary source for course material. And so what we're going to start out with is a little bit of review and some new stuff, and then we'll move into the viscera. So first, let's look at the diaphragm. So we've seen the diaphragm kind of at the inferior portion of the thorax and a little bit in the abdomen, but let's look at it a little more. So this is going to be an inferior view, looking at the bottom of the diaphragm. And some things you want to point out here is we're going to have these crura, which are going to be these muscular extensions that come down and attach onto the lumbar vertebrae, and they kind of anchor the diaphragm in place down here. And they're going to have these ligaments that create these openings and holes for some muscles and stuff to pass through. And so we've looked at previously the caval opening where the inferior vena cava is going to pass up into the thorax. We also have our esophageal hiatus and our aortic hiatus. And so some new things that we haven't looked at yet is going to be down here. And so we're going to have these three ligaments that are going to create these openings for some of the muscles in this region. And we don't need to know majorly what's like innervation and stuff like that for these muscles, just kind of get an idea that they're here. And so we're going to have our quadratus lumborum right here in green. We're going to have the psoas minor and psoas major muscles that are going to run right here, attaching on the lumbar spine. And then we're going to have our iliacus muscle, which attaches inside of here. And so looking back at the ligaments, we're going to have a median in the middle, a medial, and a lateral. So our median arcuate ligament is going to be right here. It's going to be this big one in the middle. And what it's going to do is unite the crura, the two crura that extend down here, and it's going to form the aortic hiatus. So that's where our descending aorta from the thorax is going to come down and enter and become the abdominal aorta. Medial to that, we're going to have our medial arcuate ligament, which is going to create this opening for the psoas major muscle to pass up into. More lateral to that, we're going to have our lateral arcuate ligament, which is going to create this bridge for the quadratus lumborum muscle right here to pass through. And so you can see that right here is going to create this bridge. And so now moving on into the abdominal cavity and peritoneum. So first, some general definitions before we get specific. So our thoracic diaphragm is going to create the cap of our abdominal cavity. And so the abdominal cavity is going to range from the thoracic diaphragm down to the pelvic inlet. And so all of this orange is where we're looking. One thing that's going to be really important here is going to be peritoneum. And what peritoneum is this continuous serous membrane that's going to line the cavity and surround most of our viscera. And so this is going to continue our trend of things pushing into things to create a parietal and visceral layer. So just like the lungs and some other stuff that we've looked at, our viscera and organs and stuff are going to push into the peritoneum and create a parietal peritoneum that's going to line the abdominal cavity walls. And then we're going to have a visceral layer, which is the continuation that wraps around the viscera and surrounds the organs. Between those two layers, we're going to have our peritoneal cavity. And so just like with the lungs, this is more of a potential space. It's not going to be this huge space or gap or anything, because you can see we're going to be really full in the abdomen. So it's going to be a potential space. And it's going to have a little bit of lubricating fluid just for movement of the two viscera against each other. And it's going to be, we're going to have a little bit of a difference between the male and female. So in males, the peritoneal cavity is going to be a completely closed sac. However, in females down here, we're going to have the uterine tubes, which are going to form this connection to the exterior of the body. And so that's going to be the main difference there. Another word that we're going to see a lot here that's going to be a really important concept is going to be mesentery. And mesentery is this double layer of peritoneum that's going to connect the visceral and parietal layers. And we'll see a lot of examples of that. But it's going to be a double layer, and in between the visceral and parietal layers, we're going to have a lot of vessels and nerves and fat and stuff running between them. And so one example of that is going to be the greater omentum, which we'll look at later, that can be seen right here. So it's going to be all this like fatty, vascular looking layer that's kind of wrapping a lot of stuff. And so let's look at a quick overview of our abdominal viscera. So our abdominal viscera are essentially going to be all of our organs. So we're going to have our organs of the GI tract, our liver, gallbladder, pancreas, spleen, kidney, and adrenal glands. And you've probably heard of most or all of these, but we're going to look individually at some more complex anatomy of all of them. And so another concept that we can further divide these into is going to be intraperitoneal and retroperitoneal. So we looked at what the peritoneum is. Our intraperitoneal organs are going to be, for the most part, inside of the peritoneum here. Our retroperitoneal organs are going to be found posterior, retro behind, posterior to the peritoneum. And we'll look at what are what here. So there's going to be a lot in both. And so one common way to remembering what is through here is through a mnemonic for the retroperitoneal organs. And then you can just remember that the rest are going to be intraperitoneal. So with our retroperitoneal organs, the mnemonic is going to be sad pucker. And so what that stands for is going to be suprarenal glands or adrenal glands, aorta and inferior vena cava, our duodenum, the second and third segments specifically, our pancreas, except the tail, so make sure you know not the tail, our ureters coming off the kidney, our colon, specifically the ascending and descending colon, so not all of it, our kidneys, esophagus, and rectum. And then the rest are going to be intraperitoneal. And so let's take a deep dive into each of our abdominal viscera. So we'll start with the stomach, and we're going to go through the GI tract first. So the stomach is the most proximal portion of the GI tract, and it's going to connect the esophagus to the small intestine. So we're going to eat food, swallow it, it's going to pass down the esophagus and enter the stomach here. It's then going to pass through and exit the stomach to enter the small intestine. And so looking at the stomach, it's going to be this big organ here, or here's a more cartoon version to visualize, and we're going to have two surfaces. So we're going to have our anterior surface, which can be seen from both of these views right here, and if we were to look from behind, we're going to have our posterior surface, which is going to be the back side of it. And so we're going to have those surfaces, and we're also going to form the lesser curvature, which is going to be on the right side, and our greater curvature, which is going to be on the left side of the body. And you can see that here. And you can also see on the two curvatures, we're going to have a lot of mesentery attaching to it here with a lot of vasculature and stuff like that. And so looking at the stomach, we're going to divide it up into 4 regions. And this will be a common trend among a lot of the viscera, is to divide them up into regions. So you want to get familiar with that. And so we're going to come down from our esophagus. We're going to enter the stomach at this kind of neck-like piece here, which is going to be our cardia. And so we're going to pass through the cardia into the body of the stomach, and the body's going to make up most of the stomach. Up at the top here, superiorly, we're going to have this tip, which is going to be known as the fundus. And then moving more down, we're going to have our pyloric region, which is going to be down here. And our pyloric region can further be split into the pyloric antrum in purple and the pylorus over here, which is going to have a sphincter, notably. And so the pyloric sphincter, which can be seen here, is going to kind of block things off from just like falling into the small intestine, because we want to digest first and get all of the breakdown before we just pass it through. So then we're going to enter the small intestine via the pyloric sphincter. We're going to travel through, and we're going to exit the small intestine at the ileocecal orifice into the large intestine. And so that'll make more sense once we learn the different parts, but essentially the small intestine is going to be divided up into three parts, the last one being the ileum. And so that's ileo, from the ileum to the cecum, which is going to be the first part of the large intestine. And so ileocecal, ileum to cecum orifice. And so the small intestine, you can see here, it's going to be all this really long tube, and so it's going to be suspended by mesentery, but it's still mobile. So we'll look at that. I'll show it right here, actually. So we're going to have this mesentery attaching to pretty much the whole thing, and it's going to be super vascular, have a lot of fat, and just connect to it. But we're still going to be mobile and able to move around a lot. And so the three parts that we're going to break it down into, we're going to have our duodenum, the C-shaped one, our jejunum, the blue one, and the ileum in yellow. And so the duodenum first, that's the first part we're going to enter. And so it's going to be from the pylorus to the duodenojejunal junction. So again, duodeno, from the duodenum, jejunal to the jejunum junction. And so that's going to be broken apart furthermore into more pieces. So we're going to have our superior, descending, horizontal, and ascending. And so if you can just remember that the duodenum is like the C shape, then you can remember the four parts are just describing what it is. We also want to note that the descending duodenum is going to receive the union of the common bile and pancreatic duct, which we'll look at more in a second. But this is going to be the entrance point for bile into the small intestine. Our ascending duodenum is going to come up here and then become the jejunum. And so just looking at this externally in lab or something, it's not going to be immediately apparent where this is. There is some differences histologically, but a good landmark to see this is going to be there's this suspensory muscle of the duodenum that's kind of holding this up, and it's going to be attached to the diaphragm into here, and it's going to be suspending it up at this little notch here. And so onto our jejunum, which is the blue part here. Jejunum comes from the root empty of food, and that's just because the ancient Greeks, whenever they would dissect bodies, they always noticed that this part was always empty. And that's just because of how rapid peristalsis occurs in this, which is just the traveling of food or whatever is going through here. And so looking at what's the mesentery and stuff that's connecting to it, the jejunum is actually going to be really thick and more vascular than the ileum, which is going to be our third part. So our ileum is going to be named because ileum means twisted, and all of it's pretty twisted, but the ileum is really, really twisted, and it empties into the cecum of the large intestine at the ileocecal junction. And where the jejunum becomes ileum is not incredibly super apparent as a defined point, so just kind of know generally which one's first, which one's second. And you can see down here, we'll look at this more later, like I said, but our pancreas and bile duct are going to combine here and enter into the small intestine to insert bile. And you can also see here just kind of some differences. This is the jejunum, this is the ileum, and so you can see a lot more vasculature here than over here. And so our ileum, the third part, is going to have more vessels and stuff like that. So now let's move on to our large intestine. So again, we're going to enter at the ileocecal junction, and then that's going to pass all the way through here and exit via the anus. And so the large intestine can be distinguished from the small intestine by a few things. One, we're going to have teniae coli, which are they're tagged here. It's going to be these longitudinal muscles that are actually shorter than the colon, and so it's going to kind of squish it together, which is going to form these folds or sacculations called haustra, which are the second thing unique to the large intestine. And then finally, we're also going to have omental appendices. And omentum is kind of like fat. It's really mesentery, and so we can see all these little omental appendices building up here. And so the large intestine, for the most part, should be pretty distinguishable in lab because it's going to have all of these different features, whereas the small intestine is going to be this smooth, curly tube. And so, again, we've got a bunch of different pieces, so let's divide it up into parts. So first, this is where we're going to enter. So this is going to be our ileocecal junction. This is the small intestine. We're going to enter at the cecum, which is this first big pouch down at the bottom. Coming off the cecum, we're going to have this worm-like pocket here, which is going to be the appendix. And so our appendix is the worm-like pocket coming off the cecum, and it's going to be suspended by this layer of of mesentery called the mesoappendix. And we'll look at that more later when we look at all of the mesentery. But from the cecum, we're going to continue as the colon, which is going to be all of this. And so we want to divide that further into pieces. So we're going to have our ascending colon, which is going to transverse across as the transverse colon, and then come back down as the descending colon, where it'll then turn into the sigmoid colon, because this is forming kind of like an S shape in the body, and so that gives it the name sigmoid. And so at the point where we transition from ascending to transverse, or from one to another, we're also going to have names for these regions. And so first, from the ascending to transverse, we're going to have our right colic flexure, and that's also could be the right hepatic flexure, because remember on the right, we're going to have our liver right here, which is hepatic. We move across, and we go from our transverse to our descending, and that's going to be at our left colic flexure. And that could be also the left splenic flexure, because our spleen is going to be on this side. If we continue down, our descending is going to go until the pelvic brim, which is where it's going to be right here, where it's going to transition into the sigmoid colon. And the sigmoid colon is going to go until we hit this spot, which is the rectosigmoid junction, which connects the colon to our next part, which is the rectum here. And you can see from this diagram, they look pretty different. So our rectum is going to be the most distal part of our GI tract, and it's technically in the pelvic cavity. And so it starts at S3 of our vertebrae, S3 to the tip of the coccyx. And the inferior 2/3 of it are considered subperitoneal. At the end of that, we're going to have our anal canal, which is eventually going to lead to the exit of our GI tract entirely. So now let's look at the liver. The liver is a really important organ, and so obviously we want to know it really well. So the first things we want to look at are surface and impressions. So the surface is, we're going to have two main ones. The first one's going to be seen right here. It's going to be our anterior and superior. So our anterior-superior surface. We're also going to have a second surface that can kind of be seen here on the bottom, and then it's all of this right here, which is going to be more of our inferior-posterior surface. And so we have that. We have our two surfaces. We're then going to divide the liver into two lobes. So it's kind of naturally divided into these two functional lobes. And you can see that here, the right lobe really big, left lobe a little smaller, and the right lobe is approximately 6 times bigger than the left lobe. And so you can see that here, this is going to be a right lobe, which is going to be divided right here by the impression left by the inferior vena cava and gallbladder, which can be seen right here. And so we're going to have all these impressions in the liver from all the different organs and vessels and stuff that push up against it. And so you can see we have like the gallbladder is pushing up against it, our inferior vena cava, some of the ligaments and stuff that are here, the kidneys, stuff like that. It's all going to push up against it. And so those are our two functional lobes. Anatomically, we're going to have 4 lobes. And so we're going to have our left lobe, which is the same as the functional one. And then we have our right lobe, which is actually going to be all of this, but anatomically, it's going to have 2 smaller lobes that are a part of it. So this is all our right lobe. These 2 smaller lobes are going to be called the caudate lobe and the quadratic lobe. And so we can see over here, the caudate lobe is going to be defined by the caval impression from the inferior vena cava and the ligamentum venosum, which used to be the ductus venosus embryologically. Our quadrate lobe is going to be defined by the gallbladder fossa to the round ligament, which used to be the umbilical vein in embryologic development. And so these veins kind of turn into ligaments as they develop in the body. And so let's look a little more at the liver. So another really, really important structure that it has is going to be the porta hepatis, and that's going to be right here in this red box. And what the porta hepatis is the entrance and exit for a lot of vessels and ducts. And so the porta hepatis is going to have a few important structures that we're going to look at a little more later on, but the main ones are going to be this portal triad, and that's going to be an artery, a vein, and a duct for bile. That again, we'll look at all of those in more depth in a little bit. But the liver has a good bit of ligaments that we can see here that kind of divide the lobes and some other pieces. And so the main ones we're going to look at are going to be our ligamentum teres, also known as the round ligament, which we looked at previously in the anterior fissure. And so you can see that here on both sides a little bit. It's going to continue into here and be right here. We're also going to have the ligamentum venosum in the posterior fissure. And so that can be seen up here. And that's going to be running up along this line here. And that can only be seen posteriorly. Next, we have our falciform ligament, which is going to be seen anteriorly, and it's going to be this main one running up here. And that's going to be a big one to identify in lab, is the falciform ligament. The falciform ligament is going to run up superiorly and diverge, and it's going to become the coronary ligaments, which are going to go both ways. The coronary ligament will then continue as the triangular ligament on the right and left sides, and so those are big, important ones to know, and you should be able to identify at least some of those in lab. One final thing that we want to note on the liver is there's going to be this bare area where it's not covered by peritoneum. So most of the liver is covered by peritoneum except for this one little bare area, and that's going to be where it connects to the diaphragm. And so it's bare from peritoneum, but it's going to be covered by the coronary and triangular ligaments. And so it's going to be kind of this superior view here. You can see it tagged, and that's going to be the bare area. So now let's move on to our gallbladder. Our gallbladder is going to be bound to the liver by peritoneum, and so you should be able to identify this in lab unless your person has had their gallbladder removed. But it's going to be this big thing, and bile a lot of the times will stain green. So in lab, if you see this really green sac, that's going to be your gallbladder. And so our gallbladder is going to have three parts, which we can see down here. We're going to have our fundus, which will kind of be the head or tip of it, our body, which is going to be the main portion, and then our neck, which is going to continue as the cystic duct. The gallbladder, its main function, really all it's going to do is going to be this big bile reservoir. And so bile is really important for digestion of things like fatty acids. And so we constantly want to be feeding that into our small intestine to break things down right here. And so we can't just constantly make it forever and always have enough. So we want to have this reservoir or store of bile. And so that's what our gallbladder is going to be. And so the pathway for that is going to be our liver is going to make bile. It's going to give off the right and left hepatic ducts, which will combine to form the common hepatic duct. That's going to run down, and then we're going to have this little branch, which is the cystic duct, and that's going to go to our gallbladder, where we can store bile that we don't need or any excess, but we can also feed it out to have extra if we need more. These are going to combine, continue down as the bile duct, or the common bile duct. And so the cystic duct is going to be for storage. Our common bile duct is going to be for function. We want to go down and feed it into the small intestine. And as it travels down, right here you can see that, it's going to be joined by the pancreatic duct, which we'll look at in a second, and they're going to mix. And so our pancreas, we kind of alluded to what we were talking about, it's going to have a couple functions. It's going to have digestive and endocrine functions. It's going to consist of a head, which you can see down here, the division, our head, which is going to be this curl, our neck right here before the head, a body, and a tail. The head is actually going to be wrapped around by the duodenum. So we looked at the duodenum that forms the C shape. That's going to be wrapping around the head of the pancreas. And the head of the pancreas has this additional little subsection, which is called the uncinate process. And that's just kind of the further tip that wraps up around here. And so again, we want to move down. We're going to have our hepatopancreatic ampulla. And so we talked about the pancreatic ducts joining the bile ducts to go into the small intestine. And so we have our pancreas along here. We're going to have our pancreatic ducts that are going to travel through here. And then it's going to join the common bile duct at the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And I didn't tag it, but you can see right here. If we look down here on this colored one, we're going to have our bile system that we looked at here. Our hepatopancreatic ampulla is going to be where a pancreatic duct joins the common bile duct. And then together, these are going to empty into the descending duodenum right there. Now let's move on to the spleen. And so the main function of the spleen is going to be relating to our vascular system. So the spleen is a supravascular organ and function. And so the main thing that we want to look at the spleen is going to be our hilum. And so this is where our spleen will be located in the body. We're going to have this exterior surface that's going to be along the costals, and then we're going to have this interior surface or visceral surface, which is going to be the location of the hilum. And what the hilum is, it's got some ligaments that we'll look at, but it's this entrance or exit for a lot of vessels. And so a lot of the blood is going to come through, enter the hilum, be kind of filtered and do some stuff, and then it's going to exit. And now let's look at the kidneys. So the kidneys, what they're going to do, they're going to filter blood and urine and be part of the renal tract to excrete urine. And so looking at it in the body, you'll notice that the right is usually going to be a little more inferior to the left, and that's just because the liver is so big and takes up so much space, it kind of pushes it down. The kidneys are going to be embedded in fat, and that's just going to be for cushioning and protection. And then let's look at the pathway here. So this is our full liver. This is kind of changing the angle. And then they cut out a little piece here. So they cut out a piece, and they cut it even more, just to look more and more deep into it. And so we're going to have this pathway. So the blood is going to enter in and be filtered. So blood enters in, it's going to pass through these collecting ducts, which can't be visualized here. They're going to be these really tiny micro passages that we'll look at in a future course. But it's going to enter the collecting ducts. It's going to travel through the renal papilla, which is going to be this little passageway here, which will then enter the minor calyx, which is going to be a little bit bigger passage. Then go into the major calyx, a little bit bigger passage, and then go into the renal pelvis, which is can also be seen here. It's going to be this big final combination of all of them. And that's going to continue down as the ureter here. And now let's look at the suprarenal glands, or the adrenal glands. And so you'll notice renal, meaning kidney, supra above, or ad, renal, these are going to be attached to the kidneys right here, just on the tips of them. And so what these are, they're endocrine glands, and they're superomedial to the kidney. And they're going to look a little different on either side. They're going to have the same function, but they're just going to look a little different. So on the right, over here, we're going to have this more triangular shape, whereas the left, it's going to be a little more semi-lunar, like a half crescent moon wrapped around here. And so now let's move on to our peritoneal cavity and some peritoneal structures. And so we've talked about mesentery, but this is a really important topic. So just to restate what it is, it's this double layer of peritoneum that's going to connect visceral and parietal layers. Between these two layers, we're going to have a lot of vessels and nerves and fat and stuff running through. And so our mesentery, we can divide out into two layers. We're going to have, or sorry, not two layers. We can divide into two different kinds. We're going to have omentum, and we're going to have ligaments. Omentum is going to be attached to the stomach or the small and large intestine, and it's going to be, for the most part, really apparent because we're going to have these like major sheaths of omentum, which look like these huge fat pads in the cadaver lab. Ligaments are going to be connecting organ to organ or organ to abdominal wall. And so we've already looked at most of these. Like one example is with our liver, we saw these, the falciform ligament, coronary ligament, we saw these things that are connecting organ to organ or organ to abdominal wall. And so looking at these ligaments and omentum, we're going to have a bunch of them, and we want to divide them out based on their embryological origin. And so this is a section that's going to make a lot more sense once you've gone through the embryology section of the course pack for this, because it can be really hard to visualize in adults, just because the gut tube during formation, it's going to kind of form and spin around, and some parts are going to reabsorb, and it's not going to make a ton of sense unless you can visualize it embryologically. And so we're going to have our dorsally derived ones, which will be in the lesser sac, and our ventrally derived ones, which will be in the greater sac. And so I won't spend too much time on this, but just to generally give you an idea, in our embryo, we're going to have this back part, which will turn to our lesser sac, our front part, which will turn to the greater sac, and then we're going to have ventral and dorsal mesentery. And so initially, it kind of makes sense, like dorsal, ventral, front and back, but we're going to have this spinning happen as we develop, and it's going to kind of rotate like this. And so then things like our lesser omentum and greater omentum are going to be moved to the front and back, and sometimes something up here is going to be more anterior than something back here. And so here's a 10-week-old, you can see, or 10 weeks embryo, you can see like some parts are going to be way more ventral than some parts that are way more dorsal, but it's defined based on embryological origin. And so first, let's look at our dorsal mesentery derivatives. And this is going to be most of them. Our ventral ones aren't as bad. So dorsal mesentery derivatives, we're going to have our greater omentum, which is going to attach to the greater curvature of the stomach. And so we looked at that a little previously. It's going to be this huge layer right here. And so that's going to be known as the omental apron. And it's continuous, but we're going to further divide it into a few different parts. And so we're going to have our gastrocolic ligament, which is right here. That's going to be kind of this big chunk one down here. We have our gastrosplenic ligament, which you can imagine is going to be up near our spleen here, gastrosplenic. And then we're going to have our gastrophrenic ligament, which is going to attach to the diaphragm up here. And you can think of that like phrenic. We know our phrenic nerve is the all-star for diaphragm innervation. And so our gastrophrenic ligament will also go to the diaphragm. The gastrosplenic specifically attaches at the hilum of the spleen, and the gastrocolic is named because it goes to the transverse colon. Moving on, we have our transverse mesocolon, which you can see here. It's going to be not super well pictured in this, but it's going to be back here. And so what it does is it attaches the transverse colon, going across here, to the posterior abdominal wall. Next, we have our phrenicocholic ligament up here. You can see a little bit there. That's going to form this shelf for the spleen. So it's going to form a shelf that the spleen will kind of sit on. And it's going to attach the left colic flexure up here of the colon to the diaphragm, which you can see wraps here. Next, we have our splenorenal ligament, and that can be seen down here. So we have a lot, so I kind of squished them in, but this is our spleen. Our splenorenal ligament is going to attach from the hilum of the spleen to our left kidney. So spleen, renal, kidney, spleen, renal, spleen to kidney. Next, we have the mesentery of our small intestine, which you can see here, all of our small intestine kind of folded out of the way. We're going to have all of this mesentery that's attaching to it. And so a couple things to note, the jejunum and ileum, so the second and third sections of our of our small intestine, are going to go from those to the posterior abdominal wall. At the duodenojejunal flexure, it's going to attach from that to the right iliac fossa. Next, we have our mesoappendix, which we briefly mentioned earlier, and that's going to attach our appendix, the worm-like piece right here, up to the posterior abdominal wall. And then finally, we have our sigmoid mesocolon. And so that's going to attach the sigmoid colon to the posterior wall, posterior abdominal wall right there. And so I wouldn't recommend memorizing all this. I would memorize the ventral ones and then just know that the rest are going to be dorsal. But if you would like a mnemonic or something like that, I just threw an example here. It's in a different order, but just first letter of all of them. Sometimes giant tacos majorly please my stomach. Something like that. But what I would recommend is memorizing our ventral, because there's just 3 and it's a lot simpler. So our ventral mesentery derivatives, we're going to have 2 at the liver and then 1 kind of at the stomach. So on our liver, we talked about our falciform ligament. And so this is one that's really easy to see in lab. So we have our falciform ligament that's liver to anterior abdominal wall. Also on here, one thing that we might want to note is the ligamentum teres, or the round ligament, is going to be at this more inferior spot, and it's going to be covered by the falciform ligament. Second, we have our coronary ligament, which is actually kind of the continuation of the falciform ligament up here, and that's going to attach liver to diaphragm. And so another thing we could identify is going to be the triangular ligaments, which are just going to be kind of the further extensions of the coronary ligaments. And so we have our falciform and coronary of the liver. That's 2/3 of it. The final one is going to be our lesser omentum, and this is going to be attaching at the lesser curvature of the stomach. And so that can be subdivided into 2 ligaments, which is going to be our hepatogastric ligament, or gastrohepatic, and it's going to attach the liver to the stomach. So that's going to be like all of this. And then we have our hepatoduodenal ligament, which is going to attach the porta hepatis to the duodenum, the superior duodenum. So that's going to be right here, and it's going to be kind of wrapped around like a sheath. And it's going to wrap around the portal triad, which is coming out from the liver. And we'll look at that more in the next video, but the portal triad is going to contain our common bile duct that we look at, our proper hepatic artery, and our portal vein. So that's going to be a sheath around those. And I put a couple mnemonics right here. I like LFC, Liverpool Football Club, but if you're not a soccer fan, then maybe this one makes more sense. FCL, for ventral, fancy cows love veggies. Next, let's look at the omental bursa. And so we looked at our greater omentum that forms this omental apron down here. Our omental bursa is going to be this blue space right here formed by the mesenteries. And it's going to be closed from the major peritoneal cavity, except for this foramen. And so you can also see that in blue over here. And so the omental foramen, or epiploic foramen, is going to be this like little hole up here, and it's going to be bound, the borders of it are going to be superiorly the caudate lobe of the liver, inferiorly the superior duodenum, anteriorly the hepatoduodenal ligament, and then posteriorly the retroperitoneal inferior vena cava. And so still looking at this omental bursa, this blue layer, we're going to have 2 extensions or recesses, and that's what I've highlighted in these red boxes here. Our superior recess, and we're also going to have an inferior one. The superior recess is going to be up here. It's going to be bound by our diaphragm, which you can see, and the coronary ligament posteriorly. So superiorly, the diaphragm, posteriorly, the coronary ligament. Our inferior recess down here is going to be between the omental apron layers. So you can see it wraps around here. That's going to be this space here. And now, before we end the video, let's look at some clinical anatomy. So first, let's look at appendicitis. So this is a pretty common surgical case. You've probably heard of appendicitis requiring appendectomy, but anytime you see situs, that's going to be indicative of inflammation. And so pancreatitis, you can imagine, is going to be inflamed pancreas, but appendicitis will have an inflamed appendix, which will often be caused by an obstruction. And initially that's going to present as dull pain around your paraumbilical region, around your umbilicus. And eventually it'll become this more severe pain, like terribly severe, at the posterior abdominal wall. If things get worse, then it can turn into a peritonitis, which is going to be infection of the peritoneum. And that happens if an inflamed appendix ruptures. Next, we can look at gallstones. And so they're going to be these little stones that can form in your gallbladder, and they can end up moving through and passing through the ducts. And so they can get lodged or stuck in the hepatopancreatic ampulla down here. And this can cause bile reflux into the pancreatic duct, because if the pancreatic duct is trying to send stuff through here, but it can't pass through, then bile might get refluxed up through that, which is not going to be good. They can also get lodged at the junction of the gallbladder neck and the cystic duct. So that's going to be like this one up here. You can see that's easily a place that the gallstones could get stuck. Next, we have pancreatitis. Like we said, that's inflammation of the pancreas. And this can happen from a couple things. One can be from gallstones, like we talked about. If we get an obstructed hepatopancreatic ampulla, we talked about reflux and stuff like that, that can cause inflammation of the pancreas. This can also happen if we get an obstructed pancreatic duct, which can be as a result of pancreatic head swelling. So if the head of our pancreas is swelling, then that can obstruct the duct. Next, let's look at a hiatal hernia. And so we've looked at hernias before in the inguinal region, but a hiatal hernia is going to be a protrusion of the stomach into the thorax. And so that's pictured here. And it's called hiatal because it's going to pass through the esophageal hiatus of the diaphragm. And it's usually going to be the cardia and fundus, so the kind of the two most superior parts of the stomach. They're going to slide superiorly through the hiatus. And this can especially happen when lying down or bending over. And so you clearly don't want that to happen to you. Next, we can get a ruptured spleen. And this can happen in two ways. One is going to be a lower left rib fracture. And so we know our spleen right here is going to be on our left side. So if our lower left rib, which is going to be right around the region of the spleen, gets fractured, then it can push in and rupture your spleen. Another way this can happen is blunt trauma to other parts of your body. And what this causes is if you have this sudden increase in intra-abdominal pressure from flexing of your abdominal muscles or just getting hit, increasing pressure, then that can cause this to rupture. And that's why you'll see this heard and talked about in boxers, because they're going to do a lot of punching of the abdomen, which will cause this sudden increase in pressure and can rupture someone's spleen. And then finally, we want to look at the greater omentum has this protective function. So this is our greater omentum. What it can do is if you have an inflamed organ, like in appendicitis, for example, it can actually wrap around the inflamed organ or organs, and that can protect infection from spreading out to the other organs.